Berlin, December 31st, 1938. Spartacus Olsen reporting from the German capital. The ink on the Munich Agreement was barely dry when the Nazi regime crossed a terrifying new threshold, unleashing an explosion of state-sponsored violence and systematic plunder against minorities of its own population and its annexed territories. Meanwhile, Hitler continues to secretly prepare for the war that the leaders of Western Europe fantasize they have averted. Tonight, as 1938 passes into 1939, we look back at a quarter when the world witnessed a glimpse of the true face of Nazi antisemitic terror, and to this reporter, we seem to be sleepwalking into a new European apocalypse. In the final quarter of 1938, the initial overwhelming relief that followed the Munich Agreement in Britain and France, relief at avoiding war, mixed uneasily with shame over Czechoslovakia and the fear that Munich had not created peace, but only postponed war. While the Spanish Civil War ground towards a nationalist victory and Japanese forces continued their brutal advance in China, the Western democracies found themselves shocked by the effects of their own diplomatic capitulation. Across the continent, rearmament programs were accelerated as it became ever clearer that the crisis had not ended but had merely changed form. As the true nature of Nazi racial hatred was laid bare, the free world reacted with widespread condemnation, but looked on in helpless revulsion. Already in the first days of the quarter, the terror was clearly exposed after German troops occupied the Sudetenland on October 1st. Only 4 days later, the regime tightened its bureaucratic grip on the Jewish population. A decree invalidated Jewish passports unless stamped with the red J, further restricting the possibility of escape. But it was not only internal terror that was discreetly escalating. Behind closed doors on October 21st, Hitler issued a secret directive to the military to prepare for the liquidation of the remainder of Czechoslovakia and the occupation of Memel on the border between Lithuania and the German East Prussian enclave. Simultaneously, racial persecution escalated into mass expulsion. Between October 27th and 29th, during the Polenaktion, the Gestapo rounded up some 17,000 Polish Jews living in the Reich, deporting them in brutal conditions to the Polish border. Desperate for revenge after his parents were among those expelled, a 17-year-old Jewish youth named Herschel Grinspan shot German diplomat Ernst vom Rath in Paris on November 7th. When von Rath died on November 9th, Joseph Goebbels seized the opportunity during the annual Nazi commemoration of the failed 1923 putsch in Munich. In a fiery anti-Semitic speech, he used the assassination as a starter gun for a nationwide pogrom. Then, throughout the night of November 9th to 10th, during what the Nazis are euphemistically calling Kristallnacht, literally crystal night, alluding to the massive amount of broken glass, SA-men, SS-men, Hitler Youth members, local Nazi activists, and participating civilians attacked synagogues, homes, and businesses, while police and fire brigades were ordered not to intervene except to protect neighboring Aryan property. At least 91 Jews were killed during the violence itself, while hundreds more died during and after the pogrom, including from beatings, camp abuse, medical collapse, and suicide. The state unleashed a wave of propaganda, falsely claiming that the Jews were the instigator of violence and posed an imminent threat to the security of non-Jewish Germans. To underline the propaganda, on November 11th, Jews were banned from owning weapons. The measure was less about any real Jewish armed threat than about intimidation, humiliation, and the hateful fiction that Jews posed a danger to the Reich. The next day, Hermann Göring imposed a punitive 1 billion Reichsmark fine on the Jewish community and issued decrees officially excluding Jews from retail and skilled trades. On November 15th, Jewish children were banned from attending German public schools, and on November 28th, a police decree authorized severe restrictions on Jews in public spaces. Foreign condemnation poured in, but did little to push the dial on increasing quotas for receiving Jewish refugees. In London, the government gave in to pressure from voluntary agencies gathered under the umbrella Movement for the Care of Children from Germany and agreed to allow unaccompanied Jewish children under the age of 17 to enter the country as long as they did not burden the British people with any costs. With parents desperate to send away their children to safety in Britain, the first children left the Reich on December 1st in what is now known as the Kindertransport. On December 3rd, the plunder of those parents was formalized through a decree on the utilization of Jewish property, which accelerated forced Aryanization. The racial dragnet expanded further on December 8th when Heinrich Himmler issued a decree targeting Roma and Sinti. Finally, as the year closed on December 27th, the regime's racial policies followed its expanding borders, with the Nuremberg race laws fully extended to the annexed Sudetenland. The pogrom has kicked off an unrelenting campaign of expropriation and social death. The regime arrested 30,000 Jewish men during Kristallnacht and sent them to concentration camps like Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen. Many, at least 26,000, are still held there and subjected to horrific physical abuse and will only be released if they agree to immediately emigrate and forfeit their property to the state. An impossible choice for most of them, as immigration is only possible with financial means, while the Aryanization of the economy is excluding Jews from the workplace and robbing entrepreneurs of their life work. For all those unable to flee, daily life has become a suffocating prison. Jewish citizens face localized curfews, driving bans, pressure to leave homes and apartments, and the beginnings of forced spatial segregation. In the Sudetenland, the arrival of German troops unleashed an immediate wave of terror. The Gestapo and SS arrested thousands of Czech and German anti-Nazis, while the Sudeten German Nazi leader Konrad Henlein's stormtroopers attacked both Jewish citizens and Czech citizens under the battle cry, "First the Jews, and then the Czechs." Meanwhile, the Roma and Sinti, increasingly categorized as a racial problem rather than a social issue, face systematic registration and police harassment following Himmler's December directive. It was again the Nazi complete control of the German press that not only supported but also helped justify this escalation of violence, deliberately inciting the public to become part of these radical actions. Following the shooting of von Rath, Goebbels instructed newspapers to report the incidents in the biggest way possible, explicitly framing it as a Jewish conspiracy against the Reich. International criticism of the events on November 9th and 10th was framed as anti-German propaganda and described as a failure abroad to understand the perceived threat of Jewry. To cement public support or complacency, the press cynically described the orchestrated destruction of synagogues and businesses as spontaneous and righteous anger of the German people. But as we shall see, the launch of the pogrom was anything but spontaneous. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, Hitler used the media apparatus to mentally prepare the nation for the coming conflict. In a secret speech to 400 representatives of the German press in Munich on November 10th, he instructed them to shift the national mindset away from peace. "It is absolutely necessary gradually to prepare the German people psychologically for the coming war," Hitler demanded, insisting that the press must make it clear that there are some things which only force, not peaceful means, must decide. This radicalization of racial policy is inextricably linked to Hitler's war plans and the massive financial demands of German rearmament. As predicted, the integration of the Sudetenland is, for the moment, straining the German economy due to the region's reliance on imported raw materials for its consumer industries. But it will strategically deliver massive reserves of coal and 70% of Czechoslovakia's iron and steel to the Reich. Meanwhile, total German state expenditures have reached between 30 and 33 billion Reichsmark for the year, while tax revenues are projected at below 18 billion Reichsmark. Because tax revenues will be insufficient to cover more than half of the state's actual spending, the Reich is now expected to have an uncovered budget deficit of nearly 9.5 billion Reichsmarks for the year. By November, the financial situation had become so severe that Walter Bayerhofer, the finance ministry's representative to the Reichsbank, reported a catastrophic cash flow deficit of 2 billion Reichsmarks, warning that the Reich faced an immediate danger of being unable to pay its debts. Hence, the 1 billion Reichsmark atonement fine levied on the Jewish community, combined with the confiscation of insurance payouts from Kristallnacht, is only a terrible stopgap for an economy gushing out its fund like an exsanguinating pig at the slaughterhouse. As this reporter has repeatedly pointed out, the idea that expropriating less than 1% of the population would fill the Nazi coffers is an evil, childish fantasy. A fantasy that you can only believe if you are willfully ignorant that the antisemitic trope of gold-hoarding Jews is nothing but a shameful lie. Nevertheless, the forced Aryanization of Jewish property has eliminated nearly all independent Jewish economic activity, transferring assets at deeply discounted price to Aryan buyers and cementing a profound material complicity between the German public and the Nazi state. The Nazi leadership seems to be caught up in economic wishful thinking, while the idea of windfalls from seizing supposed Jewish riches is collapsing like a house of cards around them, and their mood remains aggressive, vindictive, and eager to exploit the diplomatic capitulation of the West. While it is abundantly clear that the November 9 pogrom was no accident and was very much part of the Nazi anti-Semitic policy, our sources inside the party leadership tell us of another, more personal and emotional situation that contributed to the timing and vehemence of the violence. Apparently, the Nazi master of propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, has gotten himself entangled in an amorous scandal that directly influenced the terrible events of November 9th. Goebbels' predilection for dalliances with actresses, singers, and other artists who depend on his approval for their professional existence is a poorly kept secret in Berlin. By last August, one of these affairs with the young Czech actress Lida Barova had pushed his marriage to Hitler's favorite Magda Goebbels to the brink of divorce. Hitler, who was not prepared to lose Magda as a public companion, demanded that Goebbels end the relationship immediately. We are told that Goebbels was devastated, and while caught in a profound personal and political crisis that threatened his career, he still seriously contemplated separation from Magda well into October. Then, on October 23rd, Hitler intervened personally, summoning the Goebbels couple to his mountain retreat Obersalzberg in Berchtesgaden and forcing them to stay together. Joseph, now bitterly out of favor with the Führer, allegedly sought a way to regain his standing. The assassination in Paris provided the perfect opportunity. We are told that this contributed to Goebbels' timing to launch the November Terror when he did. Once his speech at the beer hall in Munich ignited the spontaneous fury of the SS and the SA across the country, he both secured the Nazi leader's support and improved his situation, recording their fateful conversation that evening. Hitler decides, let the demonstrations continue, pull back the police, let the Jews feel the anger of the people for once. That is right, everybody dashes to the telephone right away. Now the people will take action. It should be evident that by the people are meant not a spontaneous national uprising, but Nazi activists, paramilitary formations, party loyalists, and a minority of civilians willing to join or profit from the violence. Following the pogrom, the leadership viewed the violence as a complete triumph, demonstrating both their absolute control over the paramilitary apparatus and the terrifying efficiency of their anti-Jewish measures. In contrast, public sentiment within the Reich was fractured. The initial dread of war during the Sudeten crisis formed into immense relief following the Munich Agreement. But the brutality of Kristallnacht shocked many ordinary citizens. In Hamburg, the nationalist diarist Louise Solmitz, with a husband and daughter labeled as Jewish, witnessed the aftermath of the pogrom with horror. Most terrible thing is that the police and the fire brigade were not allowed to intervene. She also recorded how efficiently that anti-Semitic propaganda has taken root with people on the street, noting how an elderly lady told her that, if those people over there are shooting our folk dead, then this is what we have to do. And at this moment, after close to 6 years of vacillating between support for Hitler and repeatedly brushing aside her despair at Nazi anti-Semitism, it seems that Luisa finally saw the reality of her situation, concluding the true impact for her family. This means that we are absolutely doomed. While some Germans were equally appalled by the wanton destruction of property, often grumbling that property of the people ought not to be destroyed, others opportunistically seized the chance to loot and enrich themselves. In annexed Austria, the terror was equally inescapable. The young diarist Ruth Meyer captured the despair in Vienna. "They beat us. Yesterday was the most terrible day I have ever experienced. I know now what pogroms are. I know what human beings are capable of doing." In the newly occupied Sudetenland, ecstatic pro-Nazi enthusiasm mixed with terror. While Henlein supporters cheer the arriving troops, over 160,000 Czechs, Jews, and anti-fascist Germans have now fled in panic. The Czech journalist Medina Ježenska described the chaotic exodus. "In all of Prague, there is hardly a house in which no refugees have sought shelter," fearing that the betrayal at Munich would irreparably break the Czech people's moral spirit. It is now evident to the world that under Hitler's bluster and pressure, the fear of war has led the two major democracies in Europe to throw the rights of security in individuals, ethnic groups, and sovereign states into the populist Nazi whirlwind. At home, Hitler's victorious diplomatic tornado has collapsed the immediate September coup scenario and strengthened the belief that Hitler's risk-taking works. Crucially, this perceived invulnerability further weakened internal restraints on the regime's racial policies. Despite the fact that the exact timing was an improvisation born out of Goebbels' sordid sexual predation, the November pogrom was a calculated test of both domestic compliance and international resolve. 6 years of gradual erosion of Germany's capacity for public expressions of outrage and resistance have borne fruit. In 1933, the support for the Nazi regime was carried by the illusion of orderly streets with less political violence between factional groups, secured by the unilateral power to use force handed to the Nazis after the Reichstag fire, and the institutionalization of political violence in the concentration camps that followed. Thus, the first years of Nazi rule eliminated a threat that everyone who remembered the 1918 and 19 attempted communist revolutions or observed the communist terror in the USSR imagined to be the greater threat to freedom and security: Bolshevism. It allowed the Nazis to dress their own terror in justification, while many Germans celebrated the defeat of a familiar enemy, posing a threat inflated by the Nazis and their conservative enablers as the house of democracy went up in flame. Then followed years of social exclusion, marginalization, and gradual dehumanization of a tiny minority of Germans. A program of hate-mongering anchored in millennia of anti-Semitism and Jew-baiting by church and state for religious, ideological supremacy and profit. Hateful traditions that made it easy for the Nazis to cement their Weltanschauung, where all the ills of the world are once again blamed on a small group only because they are perceived as different. What followed was predictable: indifference to the suffering of neighbors perceived as them, belief in anti-Semitic tropes of gold-hoarding Jews who profit at others' expense, which justified the public's willingness to profit from Aryanization and the exclusion of Jewish Germans from civic existence. And finally, a widespread willingness to stand idle, silent, even complicit, as the regime's thugs beat, robbed, molested, destroyed, and killed ordinary men and women who were by now no longer part of the national community. On this New Year's Eve, the last day of 1938, we not only mourn the death of German democracy, morality, decency, and humanity, but also that of an international order and power balance that was meant to keep Europe at peace and allow the development of freedom, equality, stability, and mutual coexistence in respect. It is easy to blame the Germans and forget our own unwillingness to receive the oppressed, the tired, the poor, the huddled masses yearning to breathe free. It is easy to ignore the responsibility a complicity that the passive masses of Europe, unwilling to risk war, have drawn upon themselves by demanding that their leaders appease the tyrant instead of arming for a conflict that now seems and always looked to be inevitable. Long forgotten is the admonition from 1.5 millennia ago by Roman military writer Vigetius. Si vis pacem para bellum. If you want peace, prepare for war. Never forget. Don't be idle in the face of history. Join the Time Ghost Army at patreon.com or timeghost.tv and become part of our effort to keep the memory of our past successes and failures alive so that we learn how to build a better future together.